Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the Underground. Today we're going to continue our book club series, and we're going to take a look at Making Sense of the Troubles, a history of the Northern Ireland conflict. So I realize right up front this is a little bit more ambitious to probably get through in a month, but we'll give it a shot anyway. So just as sort of brief introduction, this book here, if you're looking to get an actual copy of this book, I would strongly recommend it because it's a very good reference book for the conflict in Northern Ireland. However, it's not the easiest read, and it doesn't really contain a lot of the details that we might be hoping for from an American perspective. This really just talks about the strategic level, high-level geopolitical stuff that was going on in Northern Ireland and what sort of led up to the conflict. In trying to be as neutral of a source as possible, you lose a lot of the atmospherics of what was kind of going on at the time. So it tends to be a little bit washed out sometimes, just because they're trying to kind of water down some of these issues to not appear to take one side or the other. So this is good if you're trying to have like a more research oriented project and you're looking for a source for that. But it really doesn't help us get to kind of the meat of the matter with some of these more controversial topics. And as we all know, the conflict in Northern Ireland was most certainly full of controversy. So, for those of you who have not done the reading this time around, don't worry. I will explain the general rundown of the conflict in Northern Ireland. So, the Troubles, as we know them, the Troubles in Northern Ireland, really talk about a 30-year period from the late 1960s to the late 1990s in Northern Ireland that really was the result of conflict between two major factions within Northern Ireland. So speaking super broadly, we have the Protestant Unionists, which were those who lived in Northern Ireland, mostly of a Protestant faith, that desired for Northern Ireland to remain part of the United Kingdom. So they wanted a more unionist kind of approach to things. Conversely to that, we had the Republicans, the Catholics, who were mostly all about wanting Northern Ireland to become part of the ROI, the Republic of Ireland. Or, sometimes you could say it's more of an independence kind of movement. It didn't really start out that way. It started out very small, as most domestic issues do. But there's your two general main factions. You've got the Protestant loyalists, the Protestant unionists, who wanted Northern Ireland to stay with the United Kingdom, and you had the Catholic nationalists who wanted Northern Ireland to become part of the Republic of Ireland or its own nation outright, depending on what year you're talking about. Separate from these two main factions, we also have the factions that we may know from the outside, being from an American audience. We, of course, have the British Army, who kind of tried to play sort of the man in the middle, sort of, in some circumstances. That can be kind of inflammatory because more often than not, the British Army actually did end up taking the Protestant side, of course, because they wanted a more unionist kind of approach, right? But that's a very, very hot topic, right? Along with them, you have the RUC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, which is basically the police force in Northern Ireland, which was mostly Protestant, mostly of a unionist nature. So we have all the people with guns kind of on the side of the unionists. Now, just to balance that out, right, we can't have one without the other. So on the side of the Irish nationalists, we have groups that sort of ended up forming over time. Mostly the biggest one that we may know as Americans is the IRA, the provincial IRA, the paramilitary organization which served as the military adversary to the British Army and the Royal Ulster Constabulary. Again, bouncing back over to the other side, we also have a largely unknown faction to an American audience, which was the Ulster Volunteer Force, which was basically, again, sort of like the IRA for the Unionists. So we had a paramilitary organization on that side. So these are the main factions that we have that we're kind of dealing with this conflict. So as we can see, this is kind of getting complicated right to start with. We have everything from local civil groups to paramilitary groups on both sides. We have federal police agencies, and we have foreign military assets, which, of course, complicate things on both sides. So what started the conflict that we know as the Troubles? Well, really, we have to go back to the year 1609 when the King of England at the time wanted to basically put down a rebellion and ended up transplanting a lot of Protestant leadership into Northern Ireland, really into just 4 counties, right? This is all we're talking about is just sort of 4 counties for the most part where this conflict began. So these 4 counties over time ended up being a huge, huge problem because, as we all know, and this is kind of a theme going forward for today and some of the kind of the lessons learned for here in the United States, is that the tiniest little diplomatic thing hundreds of years ago echoes today, right? So what did that end up causing? Well, there are a lot of issues back and forth for a few hundred years, but the next milestone that we get to is 1920, when the Republic of Ireland, which was what is now known as the Republic of Ireland, had their War of Independence. So following that Civil War, we had partition in the 1920s, in which the Republic of Ireland, as it's known today, then it was called the Irish Free State. That became its own nation, and Northern Ireland just kind of sat there and stayed part of the United Kingdom, setting conditions for later. The next biggest point that we have is really from the 1920s up until like the early 1960s. We had a period of, I'm just going to simplify it and say, gerrymandering and underrepresentation on the part of the Catholic populations in these 4 counties in Northern Ireland. So it turns out that most of the people living in these areas were Catholic, but they were being ruled by or ministered by or politically like controlled by Protestants. So you could have an area where it's 90% of the people living in the area are Catholic, but they somehow happen to have a Protestant representative. So that caused a lot of problems because the tensions between Catholics and Protestants, even to this day in some of these neighborhoods, are pretty high. So this is very, very confusing from an American perspective because we cannot possibly imagine walls, physical, like Berlin walls, going up between a Protestant street and a Catholic street. We can't possibly fathom that, and I'll get to that in a moment, but this is how the conflict kind of shook out. And, right towards the late 1960s, we had the Battle of Bogside, which really kind of cemented the era of armed conflict within Northern Ireland, and it just kind of spiraled downhill from there. So as violence became the main solution for a lot of people, mostly Republicans living in these areas, we also have to remember that violence was also carried out on the behalf of the Unionists, right? So we have the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and we have the Ulster Volunteer Force, and we also have the Ulster Defence Association, which, again, these are just different factions with varying levels of power within their areas that also carried out violence on behalf of the Unionist side of things. So this really manifested itself in the way that we as America like to know as the IRA, resulting in, them and other paramilitary organizations resulting in violence to get their means across. So we have about 20 years of extremely violent actions, bombings, kidnappings, murders, you name it, it happened in Northern Ireland. Eventually, even to this day, I think many of the Irish living in Northern Ireland treat the peace as very tenuous. The Irish today are very suspicious of this peace agreement. But basically, towards the end of the 90s, both sides had enough of the violence, and the British Army and their heavy-handed response wasn't really helping out anybody on either side, to be honest. So the UK and the British forces proper got tired of being the man in the middle, and we reached what we know as the Good Friday Agreement. So after many, many years of extreme violence and both sides getting really bogged down in their own ideology and really getting to a point to where both the Ulster forces and the IRA really not realizing why they're fighting anymore, we kind of arrive at the sort of what's generally recognized as the end of the conflict with the Good Friday Peace Agreement. This is a peace deal that basically cemented the end of the conflict in Northern Ireland. It didn't really solve many diplomatic things, but it did bring a peace to the region, albeit very suspiciously. So the takeaway from the Good Friday Agreement is that it allowed Northern Ireland to remain part of the United Kingdom, though with basically a special diplomatic status. and it allowed for Northern Ireland to become part of the ROI if the Republic of Ireland wanted them to do so. So it allowed the potential for a referendum both in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland. And we see this kind of shaking out even in modern day politics. Occasionally you'll get a sort of, I want to say right wing, but a Republican conservative politician in Northern Ireland that will come out and say, you know, we're going to have a referendum, and basically get shut down immediately because nobody wants to mess with the Good Friday Agreement. So this is kind of where things stand right now in Northern Ireland. Very tenuous, very suspicious, very hesitant peace, but a peace nonetheless. And I'm sure that it's very much appreciated, at least for now. So that's the troubles. That's kind of the overview that we need to know. Now, as you might imagine, trying to go through this conflict and kind of cherry pick some of the information and some of the attributes of this conflict that can apply to what we're going through in America today is not exactly the easiest thing to do. Also, it's very easy. And what I mean by that is, well, you know, if you boil things down to very, very simple terms, it's kind of easy to see how this applies to the United States today. You know, let me just throw out something. You know, you've got hundreds of years of marginalization, gerrymandering, and underrepresentation of one group, right? A minority controlling the politics of a local area, controlling all the seats, controlling all of the political representation. And you've got that kind of conflict breaking out. But amongst the people who are underrepresented, you also have a division as well. You have the people who want to pursue a peaceful alternative with the people who are kind of tyrannizing them, to use that word. I know, kind of inflammatory, but we also have the people that think that violence is the answer when it comes to the underrepresentation that they are facing. That sounds really familiar as to what's going on here in the United States. So we can kind of draw these parallels very, very loosely. Now, where the parallels kind of stop and things get a little bit hairy to describe is the Protestant-Catholic dynamic. So, you know, here in the United States, it's very, very difficult to describe because the attitudes in both Protestantism and Catholicism are very, very different here in the United States. We could never imagine in America conflict, like armed conflict especially, breaking out between Catholics and Protestants. It's just not understandable to us. Whereas in Ireland, it makes perfect sense because, well, these communities are more, it's more heavily ingrained in their society, the cultural differences, than it is amongst Christians in the United States. Now, you can say that there are other factions in the United States that make this more complicated, and that's definitely true. But when it comes to the Protestant-Catholic dynamic in the United States, it's very hard to kind of draw these parallels. I mean, I hate to lean on studies to kind of get my point across because anybody can manipulate a research study. But it just time and time again, and this is, my own personal experience as well, is that a lot of Protestants in the United States, people who are practicing a denomination of Christianity that derived from Protestantism, a lot of times they don't know that they're technically Protestant. Whereas Catholics, they understand that they're Catholic, but a lot of people, like, say, a Free Will Baptist or something like that down here in the Bible Belt, they may not know that their denomination of Christianity was a split from Protestantism itself, and it's still considered to be part of Protestantism. So, you ask people a lot of times, like, where did the origins of your denomination come from, and they just can't tell you. It is routinely indicated that people who in the United States that practice a denomination of Protestantism, they have no idea who Martin Luther is. A lot of times, depending on which study you go with, it can be as many as half, of Protestants don't know who Martin Luther is and how that resulted in their particular denomination that they choose to practice. So that would be completely unheard of in Northern Ireland, I think. But here in the United States, we just don't really have a clear view of where many of our denominations came from, even people who are in those particular denominations. So again, very, very interesting. People maybe are learning a lot more about that these days, as time goes on and as things get more tough here in the United States, people get more, they try to get closer to God in a lot of cases. And we're starting to see this research come out, and people are realizing that maybe the faith that they grew up with is not what they believe now. So we're seeing this. I'm seeing this particularly on social media. A lot of people trying to get back to a level of understanding for themselves. But coming back to Northern Ireland, that understanding was there, and the divisions between Protestant communities and Catholic communities are not just along religious lines either. They're also along political lines, and you can't even really say that it's left versus right. A lot of times it's just very, very different. So, for instance, let me talk about the IRA split, the OIRA and the PIRA, the provincial IRA. So, on the Republican side, on the Catholic-dominated side, which was, again, more in favor of, I guess you want to say independence, more or less, there's a lot of infighting going on between there, and we have actually the roots of that, coming forward to today. So, we have originally the IRA engaging in politics. Some might say that the IRA really just had no real motivation to engage in politics, and they always wanted violence to be the answer. I would disagree to some extent, but for whatever reason, we have the OIRA, which became kind of the political wing of things, and we had the provincial IRA, which is the paramilitary organization. So, two different groups, very different groups. The provincial IRA officially sort of died out, whereas the OIRA eventually became known as Sinn Féin, which is the modern day, more or less Marxist Communist Party of Northern Ireland, and they hold quite a bit of power, I'd say. So we can see that it's not necessarily along Catholic Protestant lines, but we also have things along left versus right. We have a center-left party fighting a far-left party, or a not even far-left, I'd say just like a moderate to far-left. So you see how these things kind of work out. It's not as simple as saying good guy versus bad guy or bad guy versus good guy. It has nothing to do with that. You can't look at any of the factions in this conflict and say these were the undisputed winners or good guys in this conflict. Everybody had some benefit, some downfall. So these are some of the things that I'm kind of thinking about when it comes to the United States, just kind of steamrolling through with, my random thoughts again. I think one of the things that this highlights for me, and I just keep coming back to this concept, is that history matters a lot. And not this history that you're spoon-fed in school, but like the real history of what went on. And it may not even be considered history. It may just be considered like a recent kind of thing that happened. But it really does seem to matter, things that happen, centuries ago, the tiniest little thing, most certainly can become a much larger issue down the line. And when I read this, I think, what seeds are we sowing now that are going to be reaped in the future? Are these good seeds or bad? And, oh boy, that's a tough question, isn't it? So, we see how something as simple as a simple gerrymandering event, or, I don't even know if you'd want to call it systemic oppression. I guess you probably could. I'm sure the Catholics would call it systemic oppression. The Protestants may not so, depending on which side you're on, I guess. But from kind of like an American, like semi-neutral perspective, right? It sure does seem like a political issue that could have been solved with politics hundreds of years ago, because it was not solved politically, because it was not solved with peace, that sort of mandated violence at a later time, at least in Northern Ireland. And that's really a shame, because I think that basically all of these problems, I think, could have been solved. I don't think that war or conflict in Northern Ireland was inevitable up until a certain point. Right around the time we get to the Battle of Bogside, 1968, I think that was pretty much the beginning of the end, right? That was basically where all the possible futures, all the possible paths that Northern Ireland could have taken, this one was really kind of narrows it down to one, and that was war. However, before that, in the decades leading up to that, we sort of had points to where this could have gone a different way. This could have been solved diplomatically or politically. So something to remember, and just, I hate to digress immediately, but that's what I always do, I guess. Thinking about things here in the United States is kind of the same way. It's like, have we reached the point of no return? I don't know. Have we? Some people would say yes. I most days think yes. I think that by now the United States is on a track, and we've only got 2 or 3 paths in front of us. A few years ago we had a few dozen paths. A few dozen centuries ago we had infinite paths in front of us. But as time has gone on, we have narrowed down our potential futures and our potential courses, national courses, down to just 1 or 2. And I think that right now, hard times are coming, and I think that we're definitely going to be reading history books from generations from now that talk about, 2020 was it. 2020 was our sort of battle of the bogside kind of thing, where this was our historians are going to say that was probably the point of no return. Just like how people can probably say, 2016 even, or maybe even 2020 was the start of World War III. We have these, the curse of not having hindsight right now because we're living through these times. But I think that in the future, people are going to look at the times we're living in and say, yeah, this is when it all kind of started. Or rather, this is not when it started. This is when the beginning of the end sort of began. So I know, not exactly cheery, but the good news is that even with a conflict as horrible as the Troubles in Northern Ireland, an armed conflict largely among a civilian populace in Western Europe, man, that's rough. But the good news is that even as horrible as that conflict was, and even at the absolute height of that war, if you asked anyone in that conflict, do you think peace will ever come to Northern Ireland? They would probably say no at the height of that war. But what do we know? We know that peace did come. So that's a pretty positive outlook on things, I think. So again, one of the other things that kind of jumped out at me is the OIRA and the PIRA split. Like I've said before, in today's society in the United States, you are always, always, always going to run up against internal conflict. You're always going to have people who think that violence is the answer sooner than you do. Or you may think violence is the answer a lot sooner than someone else. So you might find that, it's really challenging to get anyone to talk to you, if you are an extreme one way or the other. If you're in a group of people in your community and you are the only person advocating for peace, you're probably not going to be listened to. Likewise, if you're the opposite, if you're in your little community and you are the only person advocating for violence, you may not have a good time, right? So this really just does stress that civil conflict and civil sort of societies really approach violence very differently. And you're not going to have an easy time in getting people to understand that level, right? You're going to have big events like, famous battles, right? You're going to have famous atrocities that are like, well, now we have to go to war. But before these events, these milestones, it's going to be very hard to convince people that, we have choices here. So again, something to keep in mind with just kind of American civil society. I interact with people a lot, and some people think, they Fed post all day long, man, and they're not getting anywhere because no one's at their level yet. Now, whether they're right or whether they're wrong is up for debate, right? It doesn't really matter whether they're right or they're wrong if no one's there agreeing with them and sitting there saying, we need to do this now. It's going to be hard to get things done because right now we're having a hard time convincing, anybody to just go with the peaceful options nowadays. I mean, good grief. It's really challenging to talk about because when you do talk about these kinds of things, you tend to tick off people on both sides of the issue. So you've got the people who want, things like voting and civil activism and non-compliance and things like that. You've got those people who think that's the majority of their efforts, right? You also have people who think that violence is the first option. And having an opinion in society where you think that neither of these extremes, if you want to call it that, the extreme pacifist kind of situation and the extreme violence, having an opinion where neither one of those is a good option is very dangerous in society, because no one will agree with you. Everyone's kind of comfortably in their camps, and we see this kind of with the split within the IRA. Lots of infighting, amongst people who think, car bombs are not the solution. And then you also have people that say, well, we're not getting anywhere voting. That sounds really familiar to both, Northern Ireland and the United States. Amongst people out there in the real world today, it's pretty challenging to try to have a more measured approach to things by saying, look, there's a time and a place for everything, but having a little bit of give and take here and there is solely so that the adversarial forces don't steamroll you. It seems like it was very challenging for Northern Ireland, and it's also very challenging for the United States of America. We all know that the conservative movement, right, in America, well, let me examine the really short list of things that conservatives have conserved in America, politically, at least amongst the elected politicians. That sort of, attitude is out there. And, we look at these people, and, it's really hard to get people to even talk to each other, for one. But, there's so much division and factionalization within the American conservative kind of attitude that, we look at the leftists and see kind of the same thing. The leftists are so, man, their confusion is kind of entertaining because of this whole Israel-Gaza situation, because we've got different factions that are sort of pulling that community apart as well, and it's happening to conservatives as well. So anyway, you see how kind of complicated this is, and how I'm really struggling to kind of put into words how as complicated as the Northern Ireland conflict was, in the United States is a lot more complicated already, and we're not even at the stage where, violence is breaking out. We have unrest, and we certainly have that, but we don't have IRA levels of things going on. We don't have UVF levels of things going on just yet, thankfully. But the extra factions that we have here in the United States, we don't just have our version of the British Army, our version of the UVF or RUC. We don't have we have those, we have our modern equivalents of those here in the United States, but we also have third parties. We have tens of millions of people who are not citizens here, which are adding complexity to the equation. We also have people who are, they're born here, but culturally they could not be any different than the average American out there. And it's so hard to see, just thinking about the Northern Ireland conflict, if you were to take the average Catholic in Northern Ireland and the average Protestant, and you put them in a room together, you couldn't tell them apart, looking at them, just looking at them, you could not tell them apart. Most of the time they looked physically very, very similar, because they're Irishmen, right? Here in the United States, man, we've got zombie land in most American cities. Like, you look at some people and think, what are you? Like, and I don't mean to be derogatory when I say that, but I mean, good grief, man, I don't know what some of these people are. And I am really having a lot of questions these days as to what is going on in our society. So, Northern Ireland didn't really have to deal with that. They just had centuries-old disputes. We have centuries-old disputes here too, but we've got people who don't look like they belong to any nation. It's like, what are you? Where are you from? Like, where's your people at? I don't understand. Like, a lot of the cultural divisions here in the United States, but I can tell you, man, it looks like you're walking around an alien land sometimes here in the United States. But anyway, I guess this kind of all leads up to really something I'm having a hard time describing. So maybe some of you out there know a word or a term for what I'm trying to describe here. I have it here in my notes listed as societal loading. And I know that's not the right term, but I think in terms of like a geologist, looking at a volcano. And you don't even have to be a geologist to look at a volcano and say, that sucker's about to blow, right? Because there are indicators, right? We can look at the volcano and say, all right, there's smoke coming out the top. There are many earthquakes reported over the past few weeks. There's changes in the geology, right? Like that peak is now 14 feet higher than it was yesterday. We can look at these things. We can measure it. That's how, even places like Iceland, volcanic eruptions, which happen all the time, they have the data and they can predict these things with fairly pinpoint accuracy. Well, if I'm looking at society, I see kind of that same amount of pressure building, like the magma just below the surface is just becoming pressurized. And, you see that in Northern Ireland, and, it kind of broke out in the late 1960s, early 70s. That pressure just released. And here in the United States, I feel like we may not have had as many years of this societal loading going on, but it goes back well over a century for sure. We are definitely dealing with issues today where that seed of that issue was planted at least 100 years ago, right? Even just coming out of World War II, I would argue that probably most of the problems in the world today stem from the outcome of World War II and how the powers that be kind of shook out, and how the world kind of settled into what at the time was kind of a new situation, right? I think that really coming out of World War II and the Cold War, the arms races and all that kind of stuff that was going on, we look at the United States and the Soviet Union as being kind of the driving actors behind that. But good grief, man, there were other players too, for sure. And I think that a lot of times we just lose a scale of the magnitude for this. If you read through this book as an American, right, and you read through all of this stuff, you get the idea that Irish society at the time, or European society at large, was like a coral reef, right? It's just teeming with life, or it's like a river, in the South American jungles, where you just take a water sample from the river and you find out there's like 12,000 things living in that vial. It's the same kind of idea, right? In European society, particularly in Northern Ireland, every page in this book you get introduced to someone new, or some new faction, or some new area. It is so incredibly complicated. There's just so much life and so much interaction, and society is just, it's like, it may not be a thriving civilization, but man, is it active for sure, and there's a lot of conflict back and forth, but man, is it active. And then I swivel over here to the United States, and I look and I see just a gray, sickly, dead coral reef where people are so afraid to talk to one another now, especially after COVID. But let's face it, it was going that way before COVID. Ever since Facebook hit, man, society has been going downhill. And I just feel like, the fact that I've had so many people ask me, and so many people have been trying to figure out, how do you build community, and the fact that I don't have an answer for that yet, that's very telling, because no one would ask that in Northern Ireland during this conflict. It's like, you do what you got to do. You get the boys together, right? No matter what side you're on. And here in the United States, it's like, we're a nation of individuals at this point. There's very little interaction. What do we call civil service? Well, what do we call, engaging in the political system? Voting, right? Well, they did that in Northern Ireland too. You know what else they had? They had clubs, they had societies, they had organizations, they had cultural groups, they had teams, they had volunteer forces, they had all of this stuff. They had all of these ways that people were living their lives and interacting with others. And nowadays, in the United States, man, it's like, it's really hard to say that we have the same level of civic engagement, or anything like that. So it's really, really hard. I say all that to say, look, it's really, really hard to say that the troubles are going to happen here in the United States. I disagree. I don't think people care enough for it to happen. That's why we haven't had it happen. People just don't. They don't care enough about, well, their own existence. And this is irrespective of left, right, center, blue or red or whatnot. It just seems like not enough people care. And a lot of people say, a lot of people try to shoehorn this into whatever argument they want to make. But, when you see like kind of a thriving society, or very, very active groups of people, it's very, very challenging to see the same level of engagement here. How many famous ministers and religious pastors and priests does the average American know? They probably know their own priest, and they may know, a bishop or two, and they may know like the Pope, and they may know, on the Protestant side of things, they may know, their local pastor, of course, and they may know a deacon or a few deacons, in the church. But, most of the time, even people within Protestant churches, they're like, wait, there's a church hierarchy here besides my own church? Like, oh, there's a regional bishop or something? It's hard for people to grasp. Whereas in Ireland, it's so worthy of not mention. It's not even in the book. But I read it from an American perspective and think, good grief. There's a lot of civil engagement in Northern Ireland for sure. And it's just not here in the United States. We have fallen so far. And it's only when you read even a very troubled society that you realize, man, we're in kind of a worse spot, I think, at least today. Not with the violence just yet, but the precursors to it are definitely worse. At least that's my opinion. And again, this kind of goes back to that societal loading theory. Like, look, man, how much more pressure can we take? I don't know, but it's loading. Man, I just, maybe it's just me being hypersensitive to it, that could definitely be the case, because I've felt this way for such a long time. Just going out there and interacting with people in society, in your day-to-day life, it's like, man, do you guys feel that pressure? It just feels like there's something not right. It's like a sixth sense thing, like, and it's not everywhere. Some places is worse than others, and you can definitely see that, at least for me, I can like feel like there's a difference in, certain venues and things, but if you go, it's really mostly if you go out during like a work day and there's fewer people, you can kind of people watch a little bit more and see people are just stressed out to the max. They're depressed as all get out, and everybody's just walking around like, like they're just punching the clock, waiting to punch the clock. It's very sad to see in society, and it's very hard to imagine that. This book kind of neglects it to some degree, but it's kind of hard to imagine that anybody would ever care about anything, to be honest, at this point. Now, I'm not super pessimistic in saying that it's not going to happen, that change isn't going to happen in the United States. I'm just speaking in the context of this book here, which is that I can't imagine anyone, engaging in paramilitary activity, even to defend their own life at this point, the concept of self-defense, like it or not, like I don't like it, right? But it's up for debate. It really is debatable. Like, should I even defend myself at this point? If you're in a city, I know the conservatives and all the, people out there in the kind of defense community don't want to think about it, but man, I'm telling you, people are thinking it. People are telling me that they would rather be assaulted than catch a gun charge in New York. And, thankfully, I don't live there, so I don't have to make these decisions. But, man, the fact that we're asking these questions, and the majority of people have not even tried to engage in, more civil actions to try to, like, push back against this is very, very telling. It's unfortunate, and I don't have a solution for it, but man, the Irish, they were blowing up cars and sniping, checkpoints and things over what, by comparison to America, is very trivial. It's very trivial. They were killing each other over. I'm sure at the time, I don't mean to be, disrespectful to the conflict itself, but man, it sure does seem like by comparison in today's society in America, a bunch of Irishmen, a bunch of brothers were killing each other for largely trivial reasons. Now, I'm sure, absolutely sure, it did not seem trivial at the time, but compared to what we here, view as something, man, it just raises a lot of questions, doesn't it? It really does cause you to think about the world today and, where we're going. I never thought that we would, be thinking about these things. I thought things would shake out differently, but it's definitely an interesting time, that's for sure. So, I think I'm just going to kind of leave things there. I have a few more notes, but, I'm still thinking about this book. I think, it was a little bit ambitious of us to try to get through this book in a month. And I'm going to continue. I'm going to read it through again and do some more third-party research on it, the conflict, to kind of revisit this later on. But, I don't know how to feel about how some of this stuff came to be. I always, because both intentionally and kind of unintentionally, we always view history through our own different lens, right? And most of the time, nowadays, I'm trying to view history through the lens of preparing for the tough times here in the United States, right? So I'm intentionally doing this. I'm intentionally trying to find these little nuggets of information that can kind of help us. And sometimes you get to a source like this one, and you get to a conflict, and you think, man, this is both helpful and not helpful. Helpful because it gets me to think about the political, societal loading, for lack of a better term. But it's also not helpful because it didn't really give us any solutions for this. It just kind of petered out, right? How many times have we read through history books of, Group A fighting Group B and Group B fighting Group A until they both get tired of killing each other? And I would really, really, really appreciate it if we did not get to that point here in the United States. I think most of us would. Even people who, want to get out there and encourage different kinds of conflict. I think that really, at the end of the day, we really do not want that. Can we right the ship? Can we turn things around, or have we reached our battle of the bog side kind of situation? I don't know, but I'm inclined to think that we probably have. And that's just not me being pessimistic. That's me just looking at what happened in 2020 from a federal standpoint. I don't think that our nation can come back from that and remain intact. There's going to have to, if the United States is to remain the United States of America, I think we're going to have some very significant changes, which are not going to happen. So maybe I do think that we've kind of reached this point of no return in some regards. In other regards, there's plenty of change occurring. People don't see it because it's not all the pessimism and negativity of all the bad stuff in society that gets the clicks, right? So we don't tend to focus on the good things that are happening. The fact that homeschooling, for one, has taken a huge increase over the past few years. Hey, that's requirement number one, guys. Getting your kid out of the education of the state that's probably a good step. I know most people can't do it. I really feel for you. But the people that can are doing it, and I think that's a good thing. So things are changing. Is it a net gain? No, but we're doing the best we can, I think. People are looking into alternative logistics. They're looking, COVID caused a lot of people to re-examine what they want to do in life. And it made people really look at their own careers and say, do I want to be associated with these people? Do I want my name to be there when things go down? And a lot of people said no, and they changed their careers. And we don't hear about that so much. It does happen, so that's a good thing. Trying to end on kind of a positive note, it really is kind of helpful to take a step back, and say, things are pretty rough here in the United States, but and we may have already reached a point of no return to where things are going to transpire one way or the other, but there's still a lot of good things happening. There's still a lot of quiet things going on. Even though it is not really on a national level, we still see it. So I think that's a good thing, and it's probably a good way to wrap things up for this time. not all of these book club kind of offerings are going to be super great or super applicable. But I think we've learned a lot. At least I've learned a lot this time around. So I think we'll call it a day, and we'll go ahead and move on to the next one. So thank you all for watching. Thank you all for your input on this one. I know it was not an easy one this time around, but it's good to kind of get outside of our comfort zone sometimes. So again, thank you all for watching. Thank you all for your support. It really does help. I wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't for you guys kind of helping me along and prompting me along the way. So thank you all for that. So thank you again for watching, and we will see you next time. And as always, fight in the shade.